Well, thanks for coming out. It's nice to see seats full. Um, I've always been really drawn to objects and things and making stuff, which I think really brought me to wanting to be an artist. And sculpture really, I think, brought together a lot of things and influences in my life that, well, let's put it this way, making sculpture feels right, and I'm happy to make sculpture. A lot of what influences my artwork is experiences like most people, but for me in particular, we took this motorcycle trip, which was about a 3-month trip. And we went from Madison, Wisconsin down to Marfa, Texas to see the Big Judd installation, which was pretty great. We just took it as a cue to go explore and drag our feet. And it turned into an experience I wasn't expecting, in the sense that as we traveled from the Midwest to the Southwest to the West Coast, all the way up the coast, we ended up going through Canada, blah, 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 Arctic Circle, blah, blah, blah. But what really dawned on me as we were traveling is I really started paying attention to how the people lived on the land and how people's relationships with the land really were defined seemingly by the geography that they lived in, how people abused the land, how people lived on the land. And what it brought to mind to me was this notion of, and it's something I think I never really thought about specifically, but I think everybody has a relationship with the world we live in, but a lot of it's normally passive. Passive in the sense that you don't immediately every day think about the fact that, everything that you do has a relevance. In the sense that, like, say Yosemite or Yellowstone, you have guardrails set up and pathways, much like a museum where you can't step beyond a certain point. You're expected to go here and go there, and you can't go there, don't touch that. And I understand why they do that, and it makes perfect sense, and I'm glad that they do, because you can preserve some of the wonders of nature. But one of the interesting things about it is, inevitably, it has a tendency to influence the way you think about nature. And for me, it was something I hadn't really noticed before, becoming more aware of people's attitudes toward the land and how they may or may not be conscious of that relationship with nature that they have. So I went back to school after this trip, and I started thinking about all these things, and then they started influencing how I thought about my work. And so I just really thought how strange it was, the strangeness of how we maybe don't think about how the relationships we have with nature. And so I started a body of work that kind of like played on this notion or sense of this strangeness. So say with a log, right? Everyone knows what a log is. And rather than change the appearance of it, I wanted to kind of embrace that iconic nature of it so that you can actually have an immediacy to it, and then present it in a way that kind of tweaks that expectation of what you anticipate or expect. In this case, this is like a 10-foot long log that I've messed with its internal counterweights. So literally I've deconstructed it, and I've weighted it, and then I've put it back together so that you're seeing it doing something that you wouldn't expect it to, or something that seems unnatural, or questions this notion of what you're seeing. But the reality is there's nothing magical happening. It's just doing what it should do, which is balance, dependent on the fact that it's counterweighted, kind of bridging this gap between playing with metaphor, playing with symbology, narrative, in a formal way. So thinking of this too, you look at this and you think tree, you think log, and then you have a sawhorse holding it up, which is also a tree, which is also nature. But with one step removed, all of a sudden it's building material. It's something that's has a utilitarian purpose rather than being what it is, which is, wood. So these two logs are suspended independently. And I started thinking about how I can engage the viewer in the work. So these pieces would kind of swing, move around depending on the temperature in the room. The string would start to spin if it got warm, or if it's cooled down at night, it would spin the other direction. And so you find yourself having to move around these things so that they don't hit you. All of a sudden, the space you're in is being determined and defined by the work. And I've seen people in the shows look at this work and just walk by it, and then other people walk by it and then come back to it, because all of a sudden you're seeing something happening and you don't expect it to happen. Also, what's nice about these pieces that was an effect I hadn't anticipated. So these things are just barely touching my edges, and they start to quiver. I've had it in situations where people will touch them and they'll literally fall apart. I've had people touch them and they snap together. Which freaks people out, which interests me. I like people to freak people out a little bit with the work. But also, for me, again, this is metaphor, your relationship with nature. If you don't think about it, things happen, there are consequences. In this case, is this thing trying to heal itself? Is it literally falling apart? Depending on how you interact with it, if you respect it, it's going to go on doing what it does. If you hit it, if you push it, if you do things that it can't tolerate, it's going to fall apart. A lot of my subject matter is really iconic stuff from nature, like the landscapes, trees, etc. In this example, there's a gallery where I live, and I live in East Tennessee, which is in the Appalachian Mountains. And it was on a university campus. It's surrounded by the mountains, but you don't see the mountains when you're on campus. And I was really interested in trying to bring the surrounding landscape into the gallery. So what I did was cut a hole in the wall and took a tube, and then behind the wall, which luckily was a false wall, with mirrors, and there was a window behind the wall on the second story, and they let me drill through the floor. So what I did was divert your gaze up to the second floor and out the window, so what you were looking at was the mountainscape above the university, a couple miles beyond. And what I liked about it is I think people didn't know what they were looking at. They didn't understand what was happening, which visually becomes interesting, spatially becomes interesting. Me personally, I'm just interested in these kinds of things. Coming back and talking about just the formal concerns, I get an idea and I just want to execute it because I'm interested in it. It's not that I'm obsessed with, but formally speaking, there's a formal language I use a lot, which is a lot of horizontals, a lot of verticals, a lot of circles, a lot of organic form and shape. And so, cast branch in a ring, for me, that speaks to a lot of things. One, that's not possible. Two, a ring speaks to cycles, life cycles, nature cycles, etc. And again, when it comes to those notions of form and formal, applying formalism and playing with a formal language, these are discarded Christmas trees that I picked up off the street, and I didn't know what I was going to do with them. And one was in the sun, and the sun started to turn it orange, which just really I found beautiful to look at. So you get this juxtaposition of this deep orange with this bright green, and I just really wanted to see what would happen if we were to hang two trees in space, playing with contrast, duality, and then again, very quickly, metaphorically speaking, this becomes a root structure for the tree above it. The roots being as important as the canopy, one feeding the other, and back and forth. Leaves give energy to the roots store the energy and give it back to the tree. And for me, I think that's just really rich ground, and it's something I'm continuously drawn to in the sense that playing with the familiar, playing with the iconic, presenting in a way that makes you question that. For me, I think that's something that speaks, that is important to me in my work, and when I can speak to it well, I find my work. I find myself to be content with the work. I like to try to again play with layers. On a formal level and on a visual level, that's my first thoughts. And an idea gets generated from just wanting to make something. And like anybody, I think once I make some work and have some distance from it, it's very easy to think of it fresh. And then a lot of work can come, new work can come from old work. But it's interesting, this whole notion of mythology and Greek mythology in general, you know, it kind of like set the stage for, you know, Western culture in a big way. And, you know, I mean, we're at Creighton, which is a Catholic school, you know, and the Bible has a lot of life lessons in it, as well as things that came before and paralleled it in its development, you know, like Greek mythology. You know, I think there are a lot of interesting life lessons there. But I like to, I guess, play a lot of that out, because I think, as they say, history has a tendency to repeat itself. You know, you could say that America, to a large degree, is Rome about to fall, you know, and you know, they didn't really pay attention to what was happening and slipped away. And I don't know, the ramifications for how things play out this time around, I think, are a bit more significant in relation to a lot of things. And again, I don't want to stand here as if I'm on a pulpit preaching, because it's not at all my intention. You know, but there's a lot to be said for thinking about, you know, how you live your life and how your life is lived in relation to the world you live in. You know, it's interesting to think about how this notion of nature and its definition, it almost seems like a social construct. Once upon a time, nature was nature, right? I mean, you lived your life where you were living, and that was the way it was. It seems to me, you know, I don't know to put a finger on it, but, you know, Industrial Revolution forward, all of a sudden people are living more in cities and things are changing, and all of a sudden you want to covet something that you no longer have, being, I guess, the wild nature. And when you think about how things become redefined in your mind's eye, like, say, again, these museums for nature, I'm glad that those things happen, you set those things aside, but that doesn't change the way we begin to think of it as a culture. All of a sudden we're seen at a distance, right? Nature's to be seen at the park. It's not necessarily your backyard anymore. You know, we go out and we pour chemicals on our garden and we mow the lawn and we kill the weeds, you know, but you wouldn't do that anywhere else necessarily if it was wild nature. I guess that notion of how you think of it, how you relate to it, has changed to a large degree. And I think culture's defining that continuously.